his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I want to just follow up on the enriching, and I said this in my opening remarks, Mr. Secretary. I understand that you said that if we force them to stop enriching, they'd want us to remove the sanctions right away. I want to talk about both of those. First the enriching. I just think if there are 6 Security Council resolutions calling on Iran to stop enriching, the least they could do is stop enriching while we're negotiating with them. And I don't really think that that is too much to ask. And that's one of the things that bothers me greatly. Secondly, you mentioned Israel. We have all heard from the governments of Israel, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia. They all regard Iran as an existential threat to them, all 3 governments, and they don't like the deal. So why are the countries that seem to be most affected by it, that are closest in geography to Iran, that feel an existential threat, why don't they like the deal?
Well, actually, the Emirates put out a statement of support for it. I've been to the Emirates recently, and they believe that cautiously they're concerned, but I think they are completely understanding where we're heading with this and supportive of it. I stood up with the foreign minister of the Emirates in Abu Dhabi, and he said, I support the agreement and what they are trying to do. I was in Saudi Arabia shortly thereafter. I met with Foreign Minister Saud al-Faisal. I met with the king and explained to them where we are, and they've issued a statement supportive of the direction we're going in. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel obviously had a difference tactically. The Prime Minister thought we should ratchet up the sanctions and keep the pressure on, and somehow they would collapse. We didn't read it the same way. We also felt that by just trying to go into the negotiation for the final status comprehensive agreement, you would be allowing them to continue to grow their program while you were negotiating. And that's more like the North Korea model. You know, you sort of get into this long, prolonged negotiation, but they're progressing while you're doing it. We wanted to make sure we could try to stop the program where it is and have an assurance then while we negotiate that it can't progress. We also thought it was important to show the world whether or not, in a first step, they were willing to show good faith in moving forward. They have done so. They are stopping. They're doing this. Now, they haven't done it yet. We have to implement. Our negotiators are right now in Vienna and The Hague working on this, and we hope in the next days that'll happen. And we have plans to resume the negotiations in short order thereafter.
Thank you. Let's talk about sanctions. You agree with us that it was sanctions that brought Iran to the negotiating table. I believe that we need to keep the sanctions pressure on Iran, and that the pressure track will actually strengthen your hand. We've been told by the administration and also in your testimony here today that if Congress passes sanctions now, even if those sanctions don't go into effect for 6 months, or would only go into effect if there was a strong breach by Iran, that we would cause irreversible damage to our diplomatic process with Iran. If that's true, then, how can the United States send a message to Iran that there will be dire consequences if the interim deal does not come to fruition? And secondly, why hasn't the administration issued any sanctions designations which involve sanctions that are already in place since the election of Rouhani?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I can assure you the Iranians are listening to this hearing today. And I can assure you they've listened to us in every conversation that we've had and in every conversation that our friends have had with them. They know we're serious. They know the President is serious. They know we're serious about diplomacy because we prefer to resolve this through diplomacy and to reach a reasonable accord and to test whether or not President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif and the Supreme Leader want to try to move in a different direction. If they do, you should welcome that. We would welcome that. But we're not naive. We're not sitting here believing that because somebody says it to you, it's true. You've got to work through this process. You have to build trust. You know, when Nixon opened China and Kissinger went over and sat with Mao Zedong, it wasn't based on trust. They set up a process and they began to build a different relationship. Same thing with Gorbachev and Reagan and the Soviet Union. It wasn't based on trust. It was based on a process that was put in place. So we're approaching this, I think, realistically, with an understanding that these sanctions make a difference. Now, they know that if this fails, sanctions will be increased. We've said it 100 times, and you all have said it 100 times, and they know you're yearning to go do it. But you don't need to do it. It is actually gratuitous in the context of this situation, because you can do it in a week if you need to. When we say, this ain't working, we need your help. And believe me, we'll be prepared to do that. And you'll be partners in this as we go along, because we'll be sharing, a sense of where we are and what's going on. So I would simply say to you, we also have partners in this, Congressman. You know that. I mean, if our partners in Europe and China and Russia see us go off and we're hammering in a way that, runs contra to the agreements we've made, it really is very difficult for us to hold the thing whole. And I just think it's not the wisest approach.
Well, I think it could potentially strengthen your hand with a good cop, bad cop scenario. But anyway.
Well, I appreciate your thinking that. I'm respectfully suggesting to you that we think our hand is very, very strong, and nothing is undone in the sanctions regime. They're going to lose $30 billion over the course of the next day. They normally sell 2.5 million barrels per day of oil. They're down to 1 million. Their economy is careening. And they know what they need to do. And their people's hopes and aspirations have been raised. You saw what happened. They came back and people were excited and anticipating the possibility they might have different lives. Those aspirations can't suddenly be put back in a can. So I think there's a lot that is moving in the right direction here, and I think we just ought to try to respect the process. If you couldn't put them in place in a week, if it was impossible to design them, we'll work with you. You can design them. We can sit here and be ready to go. We're just saying to you, please give us the opportunity to negotiate along the contours of what we have agreed upon.
What about the sanctions designations that are already in place?
They stay in place.
But there haven't been any sanctions designations issued since Rouhani's election.
With respect to what?
With respect to the sanctions that are in place, if there have been any violations.
Well, I'm not sure there have been. I'm not aware of one that begged us to put an additional sanction in place.
Okay. And I know my time is up, Mr. Chairman, but let me just ask one final question. You mentioned, Mr. Secretary, that $7 to $8 billion in sanctions relief is being provided to Iran as a result, that it's minimal. The rial, we're told, is up about 30% since the signing of this interim agreement. Has that been taken into account when we look at the amount of pressure that we are removing from Iran?
Yes, it has been, and we also take into account, obviously, the variations in the price of oil, sometimes the production. In some times, they've had 800,000 barrels on a month. Sometimes they have more. It's around 1 million. There are variations. We've taken the entire curve of variations into effect. By the way, the day after this agreement was made, the stock market in Israel was the highest it's been.
We're going to go now to Eliana Ross-Layton in Florida.
Thank you.